Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here in Salem on a very cold, very wet, rainy day in Oregon. I'm honored to be presenting my recommended budget for the 2019-21 biennium, and I want to say thank you to my incredible staff who's been working so very hard these last several months to bring this all together, I think under the deadline. What's different about this particular budget is that it includes my policy agenda as well. I see the efficient operation of state government and effective public policy to be one and the same. I believe that this approach is necessary because we have a lot of work to do over the next few years. Oregon's state motto is not, "She rests on her laurels." Our state is growing faster than at any point in Oregon's history. With growth comes a lot of really great things. More jobs, more people, and hopefully more opportunity for Oregonians across the state. Oregon is at a turning point. We've done a lot of really good things over the years, but our state is changing, and changing very quickly. With the aging of Oregon's baby boom generation and the impacts of recent federal tax changes and burgeoning federal deficits, one thing is very, very clear. We can no longer do things the way we have in the past. We must grow up as a state, and we need to decide together what kind of state we want to be over the next 20 years. Fortunately, our current strong economy gives us the best chance in a generation to address persistent structural challenges. We must accept this challenge now, while the economy is good. If we wait, we're only going to fall further behind when the economy eventually falters. This budget, then, is my vision for Oregon. And my vision for Oregon is a place where everyone has an opportunity to thrive. At one time, every Oregonian was certainly proud of our education system. It was a promise that if you chose to put down roots in Oregon, your children would receive a world-class education system and have the opportunity to achieve their dreams. But over the past 3 decades, Oregon has failed to deliver on that promise. We have not significantly increased spending per student since the early 1990s. While other states were able to invest in schools and take advantage of economic recoveries, we've really had to rely on state funds to backfill local property tax limitations. How our state provides for the needs of our children is a marker of who we are as a community. After years of underinvestment, it will take more than just additional funding to bring our schools back to a level Oregonians can be proud of. Our education system is in desperate need of repair, reform, and reinvestment. It's like an old house that hasn't been maintained. The longer we wait, the more it will cost us to fix it. We must reinvest in our education system by substantially increasing our funding in it. I will work with the legislature, the business community, and stakeholders to fund K-12 schools at a baseline of $9.1 billion, which includes $100 million in funding to stabilize PERS employer rates. This budget specifies exactly how that investment will be spent, how state government will operate as carefully as possible with taxpayer dollars, and how we will reduce the burden of PERS on our school districts. I believe that this historic investment is possible because we all agree that our children deserve better. Together, we've worked over the past years to build consensus on how to repair our schools. We agree that we must prepare an additional 10,000 kids for kindergarten. We agree that we must create a school improvement fund that provides for smaller class sizes in kindergarten through 3rd grade and a longer school year. And we agree that every single student in high school must have the opportunity to participate in career and technical education or other hands-on learning classes. To ensure that these efforts are carried out responsibly, we must also reform the governance that oversees our schools by increasing accountability and streamlining state agencies. I will allow the Chief Education Office to sunset next year and will move those functions into the governor's office. As superintendent of our schools, this will streamline my oversight of our education system and ensure greater accountability across the board. Accountability will also start with an audit to make sure that the School Improvement Fund will be used to improve high school graduation rates, reduce class sizes, and provide for a full school year. Oregonians deserve transparency into how their taxpayer dollars are being spent. We also have to use this time in our history to ensure Oregon is a place that everyone can afford to live in. For too many Oregonians, the costs of housing, health care, child care, and higher education are too great of a burden. This budget makes a historic $400 million investment in housing, makes great strides towards affordable health care and child care, and matches higher education with the skills that our employers need. And while we focus on making Oregon an affordable place to live, we also need to prepare for the future. To prepare the leaders of Oregon for the future, our children need to be surrounded by successful adults and safe, stable environments. That's why I created our Children's Cabinet. The Cabinet is a cross-section of legislators, agency directors, and community leaders that worked across silos to create a system of early care and education. We asked ourselves, what do our families need to be stable and thrive? The resulting policy is a series of investments to ensure that our children and families are receiving the support and services they need, and that our children enter kindergarten ready to learn. It was really exciting for me to have so many different perspectives at the table and so many different agencies rowing together to improve the children, to improve the future for all of our children. Our children are also going to inherit a drastically changing climate. Wildfires have increased in intensity and severity in the past decade, threatening our culture, our communities, and our economy. Oregon must continue to pursue solutions that reduce emissions while creating good jobs and building a clean energy economy. Next session, I will continue my work with the legislature to pass a program that sets a firm but gradually declining limit on greenhouse gas emissions. I will also continue my work to ensure that when Oregonians entrust state government with their taxpayer dollars, state government uses every dollar wisely. That means streamlining state agencies, eliminating our permitting backlog, and modernizing state procurement practices, which cost the state almost $8 billion a biennium. And finally, none of what we are attempting to do is possible unless Oregon's democracy is strong. Voting is our country's greatest collective responsibility, and we must work vigorously to safeguard the sanctity of our elections. While our elections institutions are among the best in the world, I'll say the nation, we have more work to do to ensure that every voice is heard. In 2019, I will work towards campaign finance reform, fight for paid postage on our ballots, and expand our automatic voter registration program. Oregon is definitely at a turning point. We are benefiting from a very strong economy, but our state is not prepared to reap the rewards. At the same time, the federal government is receding from its role as a strong partner in navigating this moment. Oregon's motto is, "She flies with her own wings." Never in our state's history has that mantra been more fitting. We must put aside our differences and chart a path together towards a promising future for every single Oregonian. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
I'll go first. I was struck by, it looks like $4 million this biennium for lawsuits against the federal government and for defending immigrants in deportation proceedings. One, do you know how many, I mean, will $2 million pay for our existing 16 or 17 lawsuits against the feds, or is there room for more litigation here? Do you know?
Is there room for more litigation? That's not a great question to ask a lawyer. Certainly, I cannot predict what the administration in the White House is going to do. What I know is what I will do, and that is I will continue to fight for and protect Oregonians and Oregon values. And the reason why I felt very strongly about including money in there regarding immigration assistance is that Oregon has, under my leadership, been a place that is considered to be welcoming and inclusive to all who call Oregon home. And I want to make sure that our immigrant and refugee communities feel safe and welcomed in the great state of Oregon.
I think a better way to phrase my question is, how much of that $2 million of biennium is actually being eaten up by our existing lawsuits, and how much room is there?
I don't know. I know that we have roughly over 15 lawsuits against the current administration. I know that I anticipate there may be one or two. I don't know what the costs of all those are, and we can certainly get a ballpark figure for you. Go ahead.
I understand that you want to reduce class sizes. Why is that important as a part of your agenda? What benefit does that have for school kids?
I actually think that's a really good question. We know, and I'm hearing from teachers, certainly from students, and talking to parents across the state, that very large class sizes are an issue, and that when we have large class sizes, students struggle to concentrate and struggle to learn. My budget specifically invests in lower class sizes in grades kindergarten through third grade, 20 students at kindergarten and 23 students in first through third grade.
And so it would put in a cap on those grades?
Yes, absolutely. The data is really clear in terms of those 4 grades, that if we invest in lower class sizes, we're going to see better outcomes. And that's why I made those specific investments.
And so you're hiring more teachers, building more schools. Where's the money going?
Where's the money coming from? We will obviously more teachers, and that's why we created the School Improvement Fund. My request is that schools use that School Improvement Fund to do 3 things: improve high school graduation rate, reduce class sizes in K through 3, and increase the school year to 180 days.
So. Thank you.
And so that's an investment package on top of your budget, right? There's a balanced budget here, as I understand it, but then you're calling on the legislature to what? Raise $2 billion to fund this?
So we have struggled over the last couple of decades in terms of adequately funding our schools, specifically our K through 12 education system. I am asking them to make some significant investments. One, in early childhood education. I've added 10,000 students eligible for pre-K, preschool programs, because we want to make sure that our struggling families have access to early childhood education. We know that if kids show up to kindergarten ready to learn, their outcomes are substantially better. So we've added that. That's certainly a new addition. The reduction in class sizes and the increase in the school year, I have alignment with the business community, with the folks on the Student Success Committee. I think you're seeing an alignment both in vision and values about what we need to do to improve outcomes in our educational system. In terms of how we will pay for that, we're going to use the same methodology that we used in the transportation package. We got an agreement on where we wanted to make key investments when we did the transportation package. We're working to get full alignment in terms of where we want to make investments in our education system, and then we'll talk about how we're going to find the resources to do that. But one thing I know is very, very clear. I'm committed to the work that we are doing every single day in my office to continue to make sure that Oregonians get the best bang for every single taxpayer dollar. In the first 3.5 years of my administration, we were able to save nearly $500 million. We will continue to streamline, modernize, and make sure that we deliver state services more effectively and more efficiently.
Governor, during the campaign, you were criticized for being too Portland-centric. What in this budget speaks to rural Oregon and people living outside Portland in the Willamette Valley?
Well, I've certainly used my budget to make investments in communities outside of the metropolitan area. Let me give you a few key examples. We invested in bonding to restore the Wallowa Lake Dam in Wallowa County. We invested in $32 million to include purchases around right-of-ways for the Newburgh-Dundee bypass. And we've continued to invest in community colleges in every single community around the state of Oregon. I also believe that the work we are doing to continue to grow the economy by investing in infrastructure, housing, broadband, water, and of course, career and technical education will benefit communities large and small across Oregon.
Governor, as far as streamlining agencies, what is the timeline and process you're looking at, and how do you actually see that increasing transparency and accountability?
So I have proposed that we eliminate the Chief Education Office and bring some of those functions directly under my office here in the governor's office. I think that will increase, it eliminates a lot of infrastructure and will increase transparency. I want to hold that office directly accountable to me, and I want those folks here in my office. The second piece is, you probably know that we are eliminating the Oregon Department of Energy. We did that and created the Oregon Climate Authority. The goal of the Oregon Climate Authority is to oversee state strategies in pursuit of our climate goals and implement our cap and invest strategy. We can save resources in doing that. We will have a conversation with the legislature about what functions at the Oregon Department of Energy will be moved into the Oregon Climate Authority and what functions may be moved elsewhere.
Do you need, is that a done deal? Is that something you can do and are doing as we speak, or does it need some sort of legislative approval, legislative budget lines?
Are you talking about the Oregon Department of Energy?
The OCA, yeah, the climate.
We will need statutory authority to do that.
As you, if the state does transition to there, would most of the employees currently at the Department of Energy stay on in a new role, or would it be a complete revamping?
It depends upon the function. For example, we are specifically taking the team that analyzes greenhouse gas emissions. That is at the Department of Environmental Quality. That will move into the Oregon Climate Authority. Other functions may stay at the Oregon Climate Authority. It depends upon the conversation with the legislature. If the legislature doesn't make a very clear decision on what functions stay or what do not, the new director will provide that leadership, and we'll make those decisions over the next couple of years.
Governor, how do you look at your overall view of your budget? Do you look at it as being lean and mean and getting a lot of stuff done with little money? Or do you see it just being exactly where you want it to be?
I would say that my budget, along with my policy proposals, I would describe them as ambitious. I was really clear at the outset. Oregon's motto is not "she rests on her laurels." It is "she flies with her own wings." And I think it's time for Oregon to soar. And that means making significant investments in education, both early childhood education, career and technical ed, and also higher education, to make sure that we open the doors of opportunity for students across the state.
Can we afford what you're talking about?
I think that's a conversation that we need to have. I'm absolutely committed to making these investments, and I hear from Oregonians that they are ready, that the time is now. And I would argue that I don't think we can afford not to. The economy is doing better than it has in many years. We have the lowest unemployment rate since we've been keeping track. And we have one of the fastest job growth rates in Oregon history. I think the time is now, and I think we can work together to truly invest in Oregon.
Governor, on that $2 billion that you want to raise, so I want to know how you envision the role of Nike, the long-term care, assisted living people, and the unions in coming up with those revenue ideas.
So I think my goal is to move into this session working collaboratively with the business community, community leaders, and stakeholders. I think the folks at the table of the Common Good Fund are part of that strategy. It's going to take more than legislators, than myself, and individual members of the business community to make this happen. It's going to take all of us rowing together to make these investments. And it's going to take hard work and a lot of elbow grease. So I'm committed to making this happen. I believe that we have significant will in the Oregon legislature, and I think the time is now.
Governor, do you have specific revenue proposals that you would like them to do or at least consider?
Not at this time. What I'm committed to doing as we move forward is making sure that we don't put more burdens on Oregon's hardworking families, and that we continue to grow the economy, not just in our metropolitan areas, but in every single community across Oregon.
Governor, how do you do that without raising taxes somewhere? I mean, in particular, it must be a challenge with your budget, state budget analyst talking about a $600 million possible deficit going forward.
So I think it's going to be a challenge. I don't think this is going to be easy, but I do think it's work worth doing and attempting to do. We will continue to work collaboratively, just like we did in the transportation package, with folks across the state. We know that Oregonians support reducing class sizes, particularly in K through 3. We know that parents across the state want to increase the school year, that we should be at the national standard. We know that by investing in career and technical education, by making sure that our students have access to hands-on learning, that we can prepare students for the world of work, that we can create a skilled and diverse workforce, but also that our kids are going to want to stay in school and graduate. So Oregonians know this. I believe we are ready to tackle this challenge that we have ahead of us.
Governor, just to follow up on the Nike question, I guess I couldn't completely tell the portion of the revenue ideas that will be coming from your staff or you personally versus developed by that Common Good group, since they've hired Paul Warner after all, who's very respected for his policy. So is he, with that group, going to come up with the ideas and then you run with them?
Well, I think we'll work collaboratively, just like we did in terms of funding for the Oregon Health Plan. So as we work to put together our proposal for funding to ensure that work towards our goal of 99% of Oregonians having access to health care in terms of adults and 100% of children, we put stakeholders at a table. We had a number of different policy concepts that the group supported, and then some that they rejected. I assume that we will continue a similar process, that people will bring ideas to the table. Some of them we will reject by not being practical or not meeting the criteria that I just laid out. We obviously have to get a supermajority in the House and the Senate, and we also have to have a referral strategy. So I think we will work towards those objectives, and it may look differently than what we did for funding for the Oregon Health Plan, but I think the goal is to get people to a table and have concepts on a table and see where we can get consensus.
I'm interested in the expansion of the motor voter. When is that going to happen? My understanding is maybe that's something you can do by yourself. 2, how far and wide are we talking here in terms of people's interactions with state agencies? And 3, is the Secretary of State on board with this idea?
So in terms of expansion, this has been always a dream for me since my days as Secretary of State. I know we don't capture all folks in Oregon through the Department of Motor Vehicles, and particularly what I'm seeing now is young people are what shall I say, less likely to get a driver's license. One of my young friends didn't learn how to drive until she was 18. I saw someone else not learn how to drive until they were 20. So using other agencies that Oregonians intersect with to make sure that they have an opportunity to register to vote during that time frame. Some of it is going to come through technology, right? And some of it will come through the old-fashioned way, voter registration on college campuses. But I think we can do a better job as we're modernizing our IT systems to include that very important voter registration link at the outset when people are interacting with state agencies.
So when are we going to see that change?
Well, it'll be gradual and incremental as we're implementing IT technology.
And Secretary Richardson is here.
I have not spoken to Secretary Richardson about that particular issue, but I know he has been committed to making sure that all eligible Oregonians are registered to vote, and so I hope he'll work with me on that. I do know that he specifically supports making sure that we have postage paid for and on our ballots, and so we'll be working together on that.
But you believe this is absolutely allowed? There's no legal question?
I don't think there's any legal question, no.
We've got time for a couple more.
Governor, regarding the point where funds will be provided for legal aid for immigrants who find themselves in trouble with federal immigration officials, do you know, is this, have other states done that? And what kind of outreach will there be to immigrants to let them know that this resource would be available if they get in trouble with ICE or whatever?
I don't know what other states have done. I know what some of our local communities have done, and I thought it was important that the state step up to the plate. We have done that in other dire circumstances, and we did this, frankly, in my package regarding housing and making sure that folks have access to the legal assistance that they need in the housing arena. In terms of outreach, we have a well-connected staff here that's well-connected with the immigrant and refugee community, and we'll continue to meet and work with the immigrant and refugee communities to make sure we're doing it in a way that will connect with those communities.
Governor, on PERS, I noticed that although there's an estimated need for $1 to $1.5 billion for schools to offset the impact from rates going up, in this budget, you're proposing $100 million for them. So did I miss something? Is there more? What's your strategy on that that might not be in the...
I think my goal is to stabilize employer rights for K through 12 schools. 100 million is not enough, but it's certainly a start, and we'll continue to have additional conversations in the legislature to see how we can drive more dollars there. It's based on the work we did on Senate Bill 1566 in the 2018 legislative session, and I think it's critically important work that we do, and we've got bipartisan consensus to make that happen.
But that's potentially additive, correct? To
Yes.
the $2 billion spending. So we're talking about, if we want to leave these $2 billion for the schools, we need another potentially $1.5 billion to hold them harmless.
Yep, yep.
Does anybody who hasn't asked a question, does anyone have one?
Yeah, Governor, Oregon Democrats got supermajorities in both chambers this last session. With that in mind, do you expect the legislature to take your budget proposal as a serious starting point?
Honestly, I would expect, regardless of whether the Democrats are in supermajority or not, that the legislature take my budget as a serious framework for how we not only make reinvestments and repair and reform our education system, but how we ensure that Oregon is an affordable place for everyone to live here, all Oregonians that choose to call Oregon home, and also that we continue to prepare Oregon for the future. As you know, I've made significant investments in housing, a $400 million package. We are facing a housing crisis, not just in our metropolitan areas, but in communities around the state, from Ontario to Astoria. And so I absolutely will be adamant about some of these investments. And I also look forward to working collaboratively with both Republicans and Democrats to continue to move Oregon forward.
Governor, you'll be dealing with 3 new co-chairs of Ways and Means. What has been the response of legislative leaders to your budget, and what obstacles do you see going forward?
Well, I think the obvious obstacle is the ambitious nature of the budget. but, you know, we're Oregonians and we're used to tackling tough issues. In terms of legislative leadership, I haven't spoken with everyone, but I think it's fair to say that folks are excited about this as a roadmap for Oregon's future. And we, as you'll note from reviewing the Student Success Plan, the investments we made in my investment budget very much align with the work that the legislature is already doing.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to transition over.
All right. Thanks, guys. Good to see you all. Drive carefully. I assume the roads are slick.
As we expanded the healthcare, it was 100% federally funded at first. So as we're moving, and we knew when we made that policy decision that that would move to 90% federally funded and 10% state funded. That means that the state has to shift that funding from the feds to our own, and that we have to pick up that share of our costs. As we knew that when we were going in, and that's presented a budget challenge as we move forward. Which is basically one of the main things that we're facing this time. I think you all saw, or most of you, somebody alluded to it. We released a memo the other day about a $623 million gap between what our revenues and our expenditures are looking like if we were to continue funding what we currently do. By doing that, so one of the main drivers of that is this fund shift that we talked about. The other one that I want to say that we highlight, and just if you look at this slide, there's a little inset of a graph at the bottom there. It's talking about our elderly population. And the way you read that is this is looking on the bottom. You look starting in 1980 and going out to 2030. And the number of people in Oregon that are in these various age groups. And as you can see, we're seeing a big shift in certain populations of our of Oregonians. So that red line, ages 65 to 74, in about 2005 started to hit that big increase as we're watching the baby boomers age into the next age cohort. We're now starting to see the baby boomers age into that 75 to 84 age range. The reason why we watch that is because that puts a big strain on our services that we provide, either in the healthcare arena or in the long-term care arena with DHS services, as people start needing more assistance with either housing needs, making their house available, or something that for them to stay in the house. It needs to be one story, can't live on multiple stories. They require more medical services. So as we're watching our aging demographic, we're watching that from a budget to see how that's going to impact our state funding. Do you want to add anything to that? So this next slide basically is showing as like I alluded, the $620 million gap that we're looking at, we have about a $2.9 billion growth in funding that's needed for costs in order to continue our current services. Our revenues are only increasing about $2.3 billion. It's important to note our revenues are still increasing. We're not seeing a deficit. We are seeing that increase. Our economy is still growing. It's just not growing at the same rate or as much or at the same level as our projected expenditures. The largest piece that is making this grow is if you look over in the pie chart, the kind of bluish green, which is Oregon Health Authority and DHS, that's a $1.5 billion growth. So of that $2.9 billion, $1.5 billion of that is related to health and human services costs. The majority of that is actually in the Oregon Health Authority, where it's about $1 billion of cost, largely related to what I was just talking about. There's two components there, or three components within the healthcare costs that are costing the state general fund. The major ones has to do with, we were talking about the 90% and going down to the 10%, the 100% going down to 90% fund shift from the Affordable Care Act. The other thing is in our normal Medicaid programs, the programs that we've been operating this whole time, as our economy increases in Oregon and does better relative to other states, our base Medicaid rate goes down. That means that our overall populations that are receiving Medicaid services, we're getting less general fund or less federal funds for that, thus having to continue to put more general fund into that program just to maintain current services. So I think.
And then the final part of that too is that ballot measure 101, which was passed in 2018, actually was only a 2-year fix. And so replacing that in the next biennium accounted for about $300 million. So that's the other thing that was driving up the Oregon Health Authority costs.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is the Oregon Health Authority cost as a total is not growing as much. So they're growing at about 9%. Whereas the general fund piece of what it costs, given the fact that we're losing some one-time revenues or federal funds are no longer available, the general fund piece was growing at 44%. That goes to why the governor asked a group of people to come together, a small group of healthcare thought leaders, to get together and come up with what is the right way to fund healthcare in Oregon.
And in essence, that's what the governor's done to balance the budget. What she's really done is this summer, is we started looking at where the major cost drivers were, and we started realizing how important the fund shifts were occurring in the Oregon Health Authority. It really became a conversation about how does the governor contain those healthcare cost growths, which again is not total fund growth. Overall, the costs are only growing at about 9%. It's the share of costs are being borne by the general fund that was growing at closer to 44%. Over the course of this summer and into the fall, the governor convened a group of healthcare partners, and they came up with a funding package that, while our deficit was about $620 million, as you saw from the joint thing from Legislative Fiscal Office and ourselves, the healthcare partner work group came up with a plan that basically offsets about $630 million of general fund costs. So at the highest level, the governor has balanced the budget by, in essence, getting the healthcare community together to find an alternative way to pay for healthcare costs instead of that cost shifting to the general fund. So once you take in the healthcare partners and their proposal, which is embedded in the governor's budget, you in essence have a balanced budget that comes together. Now, the most important part of that, and you have a slide on here that talks about the governor's budget, 2019-21. It is a large budget. $83.5 billion, roughly speaking, all funds. And if you move to the next slide, you'll see that the general fund budget is close to $23.6 billion, which is what's called a Sankey chart that looks similar to this. That gives you the detail of the growth by individual agencies. The Oregon Health Authority or their Human Services, for example, dropped from about 26% growth in general fund to closer to about 16%. So really that became the focus of balancing the overall. But if you go to the very last slide, maintaining those programs and the choices that are much smaller about priorities that the governor's put in, emphasizing housing, those things, are not going to generate the kind of money it takes to really alter our education system. The two things that the governor talked about, 180-day school year and smaller class sizes for K through 3, those two items together cost about $800 million by themselves. In order to get to that, you see the last slide, which is what the governor's budget was able to do for education as a whole. The technical budget, the balanced budget, if you will, gets to, it's growing from $11 billion up to $11.8 billion, and the growth is about 7.6%. The investment budget the governor is talking about, the $1.9 billion or so, allows you to get closer to 25% growth, which is really the vision the governor's been talking about over the last 4 to 6 months to a year about where do we want Oregon to be in the future. So this is really the context we want to provide for all of you. We're going to have breakouts next, I think, in this room, where we'll have policy advisors that can talk about specific areas. Again, the big areas of focus have been on the healthcare side with what's been happening in that arena, large investments in housing, and then the plan on how we're going to roll education forward. So I can stop and take some questions, Kate and I, on general big picture stuff. We'll probably defer specifics to policy advisors. Yeah.
George, can you explain the health plan financing? There's a change in the assessment and there's a new fee or tax proposal.
So I'll actually defer that to Tina Edlund, who I know was here a second ago. The big components of it, we're actually reconfiguring what is an insurer assessment, reconfiguring the hospital assessment that partially went away with the sunset of ballot measure 101, and then other components related to employers, change in tobacco tax. But the more specifics, I'll let you talk with Tina about when she gets to her section.
So are you saying that we are funding current service levels and we balance that on with this healthcare funding package? Or, I mean, I'm curious about any notable cuts that might be within there where we're shuffling priorities from one thing to another, and that doesn't really come across in the summary.
So I think that there's absolutely some trade-offs in this budget. I think that the governor, as she's looking at at what she needed to do has increased the K through 12 budget. The K through 12 budget in the balanced budget is actually about $200 million higher than what current service level is. It's recognizing in current law, we have a split of the state school fund 50-50 between the 2 school years. The biggest component of what the governor's done is actually recognize that school districts probably spend more money in the second year than they do in the first year, just because of how personnel costs manage, school districts manage their costs. So we have about $200 million more in the K through 12 system. The way we funded that is that we have actually flat funded a series of other things. Higher education system, generally speaking, is relatively flat funded with the current biennium. So they don't have a lot of growth built into that budget. That is where you get into the investment side, is that if you actually look at this investment plan, the $1.9 billion, with Lindsay and Pooja will be able to speak to you about more specifically, that's where you see the large investments coming. So I think the governor had to make some choices about how to balance the resources we had, shore up the piece of the system, K through 12 education, that was really in need, and deal with some other critical issues. Housing is absolutely a critical issue that's been involved. Governor's invested significant resources, both through bonding and general fund and lottery fund, to shore up that system. But in essence, those are much smaller adjustments and are not going to make the truly dramatic change that you see in the investment proposal that she's brought forward.
She called that a historic investment in housing. Can you speak to that? I mean, do we know this is the most in anybody?
So I will let actually James Labarre deal with those questions. He's the policy advisor in the housing area, and they're ready. And I think a lot of the questions you're asking are actually better aimed at the policy advisors who have all the detail of what you're specifically looking for. I think our aim is really about the big picture budget, to give you that context and let them handle the more specifics.
George, I have a big picture question.
Sure.
So I just wanted to circle back on the education investments. So I've only looked at the overview of the budget so far, so forgive my not having read the whole thing.
Yeah.
But the $2 billion, so that is an investment that would be, it's not accounted for in the balanced budget?
Correct.
Okay.
That would be an additional investment. And from our perspective, that really is what she's proposing to the legislature. In essence, you have, this is what we can fund within the existing resources with a few relatively small tweaks.
So the flat funding for higher ed, that is in order to boost education spent K-12 even before the $2 billion?
In order to get to $200 million above CSL in the balanced budget, yes.
And that can lead to outsized tuition hikes, is that right? If that was left as is without any additional investment? I mean,
That would where we'd have to have conversations with what would actually be happening.
Just clarifying on Hillary's question, so there was a reinvestment in K through 12 in the balanced budget before you even asked for the additional $2 billion from the legislature?
That's correct. But that will, in essence, get into a conversation. So I think realistically, from a school district, they will probably say that a 50-50 split between their 2 school years probably doesn't cover what their real costs are in the second year. So I think from a school district perspective, they would argue that that increase of $200 million above current service level isn't really buying new things. It's really recognizing what they believe their true costs to be in what they're really doing today.
Why would costs go up in the second year, except for maybe inflation aside? Is that the kind of use it or lose it mentality?
No, I don't think so at all. I don't think
so.
so at all. I think if you look at a business, for example, they give employee compensation changes. If you do it in the first year, you're paying for it for an entire biennium, 2 years in a row. If you have a compensation change that happens in the second year, then you haven't actually paid for it in the first biennium. You're picking up both compensation adjustments in the second year of the biennium. Likewise, if there's changes in the number of kids that are enrolled, if you have more kids that are coming into your school district, they don't come in as just a big stair step, all of them on day one. We have the same thing in our human services programs. They kind of feed in over time. So really what that is, the split between 49 and 51, is recognizing their costs really are probably higher in the second year. At least that would be the argument that they would make to you.
Speaking of current DHS programs, how are they treated in this budget? Is there a projection that caseloads will go up or will go down?
So generally speaking, I think caseloads have gone up. I think there's additional staff in Child Protective Services, for example, recognizing that there's more children coming into the system. I think there's some investments on that side as well. Generally speaking, that those are the kinds of things that are rolled in.
What I will say on the Department of Human Services caseloads is it's different depending on the individual caseload.
Yes.
So like we were talking about on the demographics, we're seeing increases in the senior population, but not necessarily those in the intellectual and developmental disability. So when you talk about DHS programs, you kind of have to look at each one.
And self-sufficiency programs, as the economy has done very well, we don't have as many people that need income supports, for example, because the economy is actually doing quite well.
And on PERS, other than the $100 million in the education, is there any focus on that in the budget?
So I would tell you, generally speaking, the budget the governor's brought forward actually fully recognizes the cost of PERS increases going into 1921. So it does that for state employees and school districts both. So the $100 million that we talk about, the additional investment, is on top of us already accounting for the fact that those are actually increasing. I would also say that when we've been on this PERS path, we have known that we would have about 3 biennia of increased PERS costs for employers. We started it 2 years ago. This is not a new thing for us. We covered that in the current 17-19 biennium. The governor's laid out a proposal that will cover the next step of that. So I actually think from our perspective, we are covering what the PERS increases are. And then on top of it, setting aside an additional $100 million of general fund. I should also mention that in 1921 as well, there's already, based on the work that happened during the 2018 session, we believe another $100 million that's going to be in that school district side account. So in 1921, it's not just the $100 million of general fund, but the $100 million that the legislature had already directed into that path. So in 1921, we think there's north of about $200+ million in that account. And because the legislature set aside that other one-time revenues would go in there as well, increased debt collection, things like that. And I think on some of our corporate changes that we've had, those will also go into there. So it's not like this is a one-shot deal. This is a growing over time as the legislature set it up.
What about the employer incentive fund?
So I will let Tina answer the more specific questions on the healthcare plan.
Any other big trade-offs you want to know beyond schools? And you mentioned housing, but look, I'm just, things that we flat funded or maybe.
I think those are the big choices. I'll look to Nick or anyone else that we want to mention. Those are the big things I think were in the budget. Really the focus on making sure that we stabilize the K-12 system, working with our higher education partners, and those are going to be conversations we'll have, and then the investment in housing. And I think there's been lots of discussion about housing and where we're trying to go. Governor's also been pretty strategic about using her bonding authority. She has not fully spent all of her bonding capacity. She's used some of that really to shore up the housing system and some of the things that she talked about with rural investments. There's over $78 million or $75 million of investment in the infrastructure fund at Business Oregon, 80% of which goes to rural communities. So she really has had a large focus in that area as we've moved forward.
Have you accounted for a likely kicker?
So there is projected a kicker for 2017-19, which gets paid out in the next biennium. Those numbers are absolutely embedded in these forecasts. In fact, it gets a little bit tricky. I should probably mention it, and maybe this will be the last thing I do before we slide out. When you look at revenues, it gets a little bit tricky. Technically speaking, revenues when a kicker kicks is because the economy has been growing so well in 2017-19. So you will see that our beginning balance is a really large number. I think it's north of 1.4 billion of carry forward money. Technically speaking, the kicker does not come out of the biennium it's generated. It actually is a reduction in taxes collected in the next biennium. So revenues, I think we're around a kicker of $600+ million projected right now. That is built into the revenue forecast and is actually a reduction in revenue built into the governor's budget for the next biennium. So it is fully accounted for. But it makes revenues in the next biennium look probably smaller than they really will be.
Thank you.